Hi guys, so Baroness Harding, the head of Test and Trace, was speaking at a select committee on testing where she answered questions, and her way of answering the questions was really weird. So let's hear what she had to say.
I think that Professor Hannigan and the previous witnesses in your earlier session referred to some of this, which is that it's an entirely human thing to be scared and worried and to then think that the answer is to get a test. And so, if I, again, give you some examples, a restaurant owner contacted me yesterday where one of their staff had tested positive, and they then asked all of the staff to go and get tested.
And that's the correct approach. Isn't that what test and trace is? Maybe I'm misunderstanding something. Maybe I'm just not getting it. But I always thought that test, so what you do is you find somebody who is test positive, then you trace the people who they came into contact with, and then you test all of them. And then if you find any of those are positive, you trace the contact that those positive cases had with other members of the community, and you build up a record or a database or a graph or a diagram of the numbers of cases you had in that area, and you're able to trace contact that people had and build up data that you can use going forward. Is that not what test and trace is?
Whereas actually, unless they had symptoms, they really didn't need to be tested.
That could happen.
Okay, but don't you know that there is asymptomatic transmission? So you test somebody, they're positive, they work in a restaurant, they test positive. And your answer is like, well, unless the other members of the staff have symptoms, we're not going to test them. But if they're asymptomatic, they're not going to show symptoms. And they're going to go around going to work, going home, visiting people while asymptomatic and spreading the pandemic. Now, look, I'm not an expert. I'm not the head of Test and Trace. And maybe my criticisms are invalid. But that's the impression I got what Test and Trace was about.
It happened any time. There's no reason why September has seen this increase in demand.
I think we, again, as Professor Hannigan pointed to, I think with all of our children going back to school, we've seen a very marked increase in the number of young children coming forward to be tested. So a doubling of the number of children under 17 coming forward to be tested. And
of course, because they're going back to school. Before, they were not getting into contact with large groups of other children. Now you're forcing them. I'm not saying in a negative way. It's because it's a school. They're forced to be together. You're forcing them into a confined space. And of course, you're going to see a rise in cases with younger people.
More than that in the ages of 5 to 9. And again, I think, as I say, I completely understand this. I've got children at school myself. The temptation is one of your children has a temperature, they need a test, but then the rest of the family gets tested as well.
We knew the children were going...
Once again, this point, if one of the children has a temperature, you get a test. If the test is negative, I don't think there's anything else to do. But if they test positive, you need to test the other members of the family. Why would you not?
Back to school in September, did we not? It didn't
Yes,
come
we
as a
did.
surprise.
And we planned for a sizable increase in testing capacity. As I've just described, we've been adding testing capacity every day, every week, over the course of the last few weeks, in anticipation.
But not enough.
Well, plainly,
By multiple factors.
As the Prime Minister said yesterday, plainly...
Okay, blame Boris Johnson. This is a typical Tory tactic. I'm getting some heat. It's Boris Johnson's fault. But don't worry, Boris can take the heat because he'll reflect the heat back onto someone else, probably the public or Matt Hancock. This is absurd. This is the head of Test and Trace who's saying that if somebody tests positive, that's as far as we go. We don't do anything else. And the fact that, we didn't know that when schools would reopen, we'd see a spike in cases. Everybody has been saying this. I have been saying this. And I'm a friggin' 2-bit YouTuber. And I have been saying for months that when children go back to school, you're going to see a spike. How is it possible that the head of Test and Trace didn't understand this? Now, you probably wonder, okay, why is all of this happening? Why is there a lack of capacity for tests? Well, it's because the Tories decided, instead of actually investing in the NHS, providing the NHS with the resources it needs to do all of this, they thought, let's rely on the private sector instead. Now, this is an article from The Guardian from the 21st of August, so it's less than a month ago. It says, outsourcing firms missed 46% of COVID contacts in England's worst hit areas. Serco and Settle paid £200 million to test and trace, but reached just over half of the infected people contacted in some regions. So the private sector was paid lots of money to do this job, and they're not capable of doing this job. In the same way that Matt Hancock handed over lots of money to private companies to develop an app, and then the app had to be thrown in the bin because it wasn't working. And then they had to rely on Apple and Google to develop an app instead. You know, they don't learn from... Look at even Brexit, where they were talking about... They were giving money to a company, a so-called ferry company, that didn't actually have any boats. It's insane and corrupt. And how the hell did Baroness Harding become the head of Test and Trace when she doesn't seem to understand what... She understands the testing part, but she doesn't seem to understand the second part, the tracing. This is a shambles. This is not just a game. This is not just corruption. This is not just incompetence. This is extremely serious. Younger people are going back to public education and private education, but they're going back to education. They're back into schools. We're going to see a spike in cases. I don't know what the government was expecting to happen. Were they hoping, look, if we ignore it, perhaps it will go away? And as we go into the winter, you're going to see a huge problem because the weather's going to get colder. More people are going to be indoors, closer together. So you're going to start to see a spike in cases there. And because it's cold weather, we won't know if somebody has a cold, the flu, if they have the pandemic. So people will ask for tests because we won't know whether they will be infected or not. They'll have to be tested. And if they result positive, then we have to do tracing. But I think at this stage, the tracing is not going to work. And I think the government are just going to abandon tracing because tracing works when you have a small number of cases. You find them early and you're able to deal with the problem very quickly. But instead, what the government did was they started tracing at the beginning, they stopped it, and then they restarted it later. And now it's too late because you have too many cases. Thousands of cases every day. You can't test and trace all of those. There aren't the resources available. And I think what the government are trying to do is just shift the blame to someone else. Harding seems to be shifting the blame onto Boris Johnson, and then Boris Johnson will probably just shift the blame onto either Matt Hancock or the people. You didn't respect the regulations. You didn't socially distance. You didn't wear a mask. It's your fault we're having all these cases. Not that we haven't invested in the NHS over the last 10 years. Not because we didn't buy PPE and equipment and tests. It's not because we outsourced work that should be done by the state to private companies because, well, these private companies have connections to our party. I really hope that a disaster is not coming But the news around this seems to be that a second wave is coming, and the disaster that will come along with that. Let me know in the comments section, guys, what you think. As always, your comments are greatly appreciated. Thanks a lot. I want to say a big thank you to all of my patrons. You ensure that this channel continues to exist. I'm eternally grateful for all of your support. If you join Patreon, you will receive instant access to our Discord server, where we have both audio and video chats. You can chat with me and other patrons, where we discuss important and non-important issues. Becoming a patron per month costs about the same as a large coffee, so why not check it out?